Hello, my name is Bill Toner. My real full name is William E. Toner, Jr. I've been a resident of Longmeadow, Massachusetts for many years, close to 50 years. I was born in New Haven, Connecticut, and lived there until I was 11, and then I moved to Longmeadow, Mass, because my parents moved. My father got another job and moved up to this area from Connecticut. And I have been in the Longmeadow public school system when I was younger. I graduated from Longmeadow High School. And then I went to Washington, D.C., to Georgetown University to college, where I was in the business administration program. I graduated from college in 1965. At that time, the Vietnam War was in its initial stages, but the troop buildup was coming, and all of us in college, of course, had a hot topic of discussion as to where you were going to be in the draft, because there was an involuntary draft at that time. Everybody had a number and everybody was screened for the draft. And as I recall, I think I was a senior in my, maybe it was the first semester or second semester, I had to report for a draft physical, and I had to get on a bus downtown in Washington. They trucked us over to Baltimore, Maryland. We went through a physical. And of course, I was on pins and needles thinking, you know, I'm going to be drafted right out of college. I wasn't. I graduated in 1965, the spring of 1965, I graduated from college. And I got a job on an insurance company in Hartford, Connecticut. And the draft board wanted to know what my status was, and I told them that I was a student still, because I had enrolled in graduate business programs at the University of Connecticut in Hartford. They had a branch in Hartford, and I was going there. So in the daytime, I worked for the insurance company. At night, I went to school. And I got a deferment. And this was in the summer of 65. In the summer of 66, I had to decide whether or not to continue these studies or be drafted. So I figured the best thing I could do was tell the draft board I was still a student, full-time, which I wasn't, but I told them I was. And I somehow, the University of Connecticut notified the draft board that I was still a student. But lo and behold, I think I got a letter of some sort after the school began. Let's say the school began in August or September of 1966. I got a letter that said that I was to report to the draft board for, and they told me that I would be drafted by the end of October. Across the hall from the draft board in Springfield, Massachusetts, where the federal government had their offices, was the Army recruiter. So I walked into the Army recruiters and said, I'm about to be drafted. Would I get a better deal if I volunteered? And they said yes. So I volunteered to join the Army just before I was going to be drafted. So on Halloween 1966, the last day of October, we all had to report to the Office of Induction and be sworn in and taken to Fort Dix, New Jersey. And the recruiter at the Army recruiting office said that you would probably get a better choice of what you would do in the Army if you joined, so I did. And they said, well, because you're a college graduate, you can go to the basic training and what have you, and then you can go to an officer candidate school. So off we went to Fort Dix, New Jersey, where you spent, I can't remember exactly how many weeks. If you started the last of October, the 1st of November, you didn't finish until mid-January. And that was basic training, which was obviously basic infantry training for the Army, where you learned everything from shooting a rifle to how to stand right and how to march and how to put on your uniform and take it off and be clean and efficient and on time and all the other things you learned in 10 weeks of basic training. Along with another, well, you're broken up into platoons and companies, and a company had 100 people. And because the Vietnam War was building up and they were aiming to have 500,000 troops in country, that is in Vietnam, there must have been, I can't count how many tens of thousands of people must have been training at Fort Dix at that time, but it was obviously a busy place. Finished the basic training at Fort Dix. If this is a story about the military and the efficiency of the military, which is tongue-in-cheek, of course, I should tell the story about the drill sergeant that we had the first time you go there. You don't know anything about how to act in the military, what to do, but the drill sergeants make you learn it very, very quickly, probably within the first 24 hours. And so they ask you to line up what you do, and you have to say your name. So they come all the way down. They ask us to line up in alphabetical order. Nobody even knows each other's names, but somehow or another, the T's, of course, Toner, my last name, I'm way in the back. And so when I signed up for the Army, you had to show a birth certificate. My birth certificate says Toner, comma, William. No William E. Toner, Jr. that my mother and father had called me forever. So I'm filling in forms in the Army, putting down William E. Toner Jr., and of course this sergeant sees that I'm officially known as Toner, William. And so a big controversy occurred about the E and the junior. And the drill sergeant who was in charge of our group, the 100 people or so, lines up, and he says, all right, now wait a minute, everybody quiet. And he goes into this rampage about the heck with the Army and on and on and on about, I don't care what they say, from now on you're known as Toner, William, period, no questions, period. I say, oh my gosh, here goes my name, let alone my identity as I join the military and get into this rigorous life of regimentation. But that was just an example of what it's like to join from civilian life and go into the military with the different lifestyle that you're not used to. That was just the beginning. Of course, there were many, many other procedures and incidents that trained you to be a good soldier, so to speak. So from the basic training at Fort Dix that everybody went through, you went to a thing called advanced infantry training, because basically everybody in the Army that joins is an infantry soldier. The ultimate purpose is to pick up a rifle and defend, no matter what your assigned job is. You could be a computer operator, but you still basically have to learn how to be an infantry soldier. So you go through 10 weeks or whatever it is at Fort Dix, and then you go to a second phase of it, which is known as advanced infantry training, which is another 10 weeks. And that could take you anywhere. You could stay at Fort Dix, you could go to the West Coast, South, or whatever it is. Well, obviously, you spend a lot of time outside during this training. You're out on bivouacs, which could be anywhere from 1 night to 5 or 7 nights out in the woods, sleeping in tents and very, very basic accommodations. Excuse me. By some luck of the draw, they came through the barracks on a weekend at the end of this basic training and said, this group here, and I was one of the members of the group, were being taken to Alabama for their advanced infantry training in Alabama, which was a godsend to us because it was a tough winter and it was getting very cold and snowy in New Jersey. And lo and behold, we got shipped off to Alabama, where we were in Anniston, Alabama at Fort McClellan, which was a smaller base and much more civilized because it was almost like a little town, and it was a nice base, and it was warm. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't real cold. Like at night it would go down to 40s maybe, and in the daytime anywhere from 55 to 70. So you would have to dress warmly on these bivouacs, but that was a nice change. I mean, you had to go through this rigorous infantry training, and it wasn't easy, and you were doing all sorts of hiking out in the hills and mountains and fording streams and playing war games and all this other stuff. But some of the most memorable things in the Army is the camaraderie of your fellow troops. You meet an awful lot of great people. Sure, there are some bad apples in the group, but that's life. But you meet an awful lot of great people that you have a wonderful time with, and you bond with because you're living with them constantly, and you depend upon each other, and you learn to work as a team, and you forget your own individual needs for the benefit of the group, which is, in my opinion, wonderful training because it gives you life skills you wouldn't have had. I was very fortunate to be brought up in a wonderful household with loving parents and 2 older sisters. I was very fortunate to live in a nice house and have a good education and good value system, I think, taught to me. But those things are good to have, and they're wonderful tools for life, and it's a wonderful foundation. But I thought that the Army gave you a lot more than that. It gave you this sense that you're not the most important person in the world by far, and you really learn to do teamwork, and you really learn to work with others and to understand others and to give and take so that as a group you can achieve the goals that you work toward. You wish that you could keep up with all the people that you met in the service. You can't. There are innumerable ones. Everybody goes their different ways when you get out, and that's the way it is. So here we are in Fort McClellan, Alabama, and one of the wonderful parts of being sent there was Fort McClellan was a Women's Army Corps training base also. So they called them WACs, Women's Army Corps, and they also were on the base. Now, we were segregated from them by several miles, and we were not allowed over to their area. Of course, once in a while we'd be out marching, And on one of these hikes or marches or whatever, of course the girls would be there and the cat calls would start and the sergeants would be yelling at us to keep quiet and the girls would be giggling at us, and that was, part of the game. Other than that, you were pretty much confined to the base anyway because you were still just above basic training and you only got off the base once in a while. I don't recall much that went on in the small town of Anniston, Alabama. We'd just go down there like on a Sunday and get a meal or something like that, and that was about it. From Fort McClellan, Alabama, I went to Fort Eustis, Virginia, to an officer candidate school. The officer candidate school was for the Transportation Corps. I guess a lot of people know that the Army is divided up into different corps, which are for different areas of responsibility. Like there's the infantry and the artillery and the armor and, then there are logistic corps like the supply and intelligence and military police and all that. Well, I wound up in transportation. I don't know how. As I recall, when I went to the draft board and they told me I was going to be drafted, and I found out that I could volunteer and more or less be promised, so to speak, a particular job or type of training for a job, I believe that they said to me that they needed transportation officers, and would you like to be a transportation officer? And I thought to myself, maybe that's better than the infantry because you wouldn't be shot at as much or something. I don't know. I didn't mean to chicken out, but that's just the way I decided at that time. So I wound up in the Transportation Corps Officers Candidate School at Fort Eustis, Virginia. And meanwhile, we'd already been to 10 weeks of basic training with, the vigorous discipline thing where, the drill sergeants would yell at you and make you do push-ups if you did something wrong. And of course, everybody did everything wrong because they didn't know how to do anything anyway. And that went on for the 10 weeks of basic training and 10 weeks of advanced infantry training. But when you finished advanced infantry training, you felt like you might have been a soldier because you'd been through all of this training and what have you. Well, obviously, those were false pretenses because once you got to the officer candidate school, we arrived there, I think it was on a Sunday, and this would have been in the end of March or beginning of April of 1967. And there would have been 100 people in each class of OCS, Officer Candidate School. And there would be probably 8 or 9 classes going through at once at different stages. So there's a beginning class, and it's a 26 or 7 week program. So each group starts week by week, and they phase through all the different 26 weeks of training. Let's say we got there on a Sunday, so you report, and they show you to a place to sign in, and they give you this, and they give you that, and they give you supplies and what have you. And then you get assigned to a barracks, and you go into the barracks. And the barracks look pretty nice. There were these prefab buildings, concrete slabs, what do I call them? Butler buildings, I guess. They made out of steel. And the beds looked new, and the floors were shiny and all this. And we thought this would be very luxurious compared to the Fort Dix and Fort McClellan rough barracks. Well, it was fine until what they call the tactical officers, which is the equivalent of a drill sergeant, but an officer candidate school. They also are lieutenants or captains. And they came in, let's say at about 6 o'clock at night or something like that. And it was like a shock to your life because all of a sudden these tactical officers are walking up and down, screaming and yelling orders, trying to cause mayhem, I guess, and yelling at everybody, telling them, get your gear put away, get your locker all straightened out, get your bed made, get ready to go out in formation, get your uniform on, do this. And they gave you more orders that you could do in a week that you had to do in the next 5 minutes. So of course everybody did everything wrong, and they would come up to you and they'd tell you to what they call brace against the locker, which means you have to stand at attention with your back flat against the steel locker. And they all had swagger sticks. So that's the tool of choice of the tactical officer. And they would bang the swagger stick on the locker saying, what is your name? And you'd say Toner, and they'd say, no, that's wrong, you can't say that. And they'd tell you how to say your name right, and then, they drilled you. Well, this went on for 26 weeks, but it was phased in. The first section of officer candidate school was either 8 or 9 weeks. That was the first third. And we had to go through a lot of basic training again, and a lot of infantry type training. There was classroom. A typical day is you'd get up at, I think it was like 5 in the morning, 5:30 in the morning. You'd go out and you'd have some kind of calisthenics. You'd run, you'd do push-ups or calisthenics or what have you. And then you would come back and you would get dressed and have a breakfast of some sort. Then you'd go off to a class, then you'd have field exercises sometime during the day, probably more exercises, and then at night you'd have dinner. But in the meantime, you had to make sure that the barracks that you lived in was in perfect shape, spit and polish, ready for inspection at any time. So you can imagine 100 guys running in, getting changed after being all sweaty, being out there in the field, getting everything hung up perfectly straight, changed into a uniform for the day, and back out there at attention. Probably they gave you 10 minutes to do the whole thing. And of course it was always wrong, so you had to go back in and fix up everything that was wrong. And they would give us demerits if you did anything wrong. For example, your bed had a wrinkle in it, your shoes weren't perfectly polished. Well, the first week the demerits flew by the hundreds. And to work off the demerits, you did chores on the weekends. And the chores could be anywhere from maintaining the grounds or working in the office or something like that. But most of the chores involved physical calisthenics or exercise. And they would say that if you have the choice of what to do to work off the demerits, you could go on a tour, they called it, which was really a hike or a jog or a forced march. And you'd get on combat boots and fatigues, which were, the baggy pants and the shirt. And I don't think you had to carry you might have to carry a light pack with water in it, but you'd start out marching. And you would get into a jog, and you'd be jogging for, I don't know, it must have been an hour or two. And it would just go on and on and on. And there'd be, out of 100 people, there'd be probably 75 of us would have to go on the tour to work off demerits because everybody had so many demerits. Different people reacted different ways to these things. Some people psychologically could take the pressure of constant harassment and constant towing the line to the task at hand. Other people frustrated them an awful lot and they started to break. But the purpose of the whole training, it seemed, was to teach you that your individual desires have to be put second to the needs of the entire unit and survival and accomplishing the mission that's been assigned to you. So all these little things were to teach you that. And it was interesting because you thought you knew yourself until you went through this, and then you really did learn who you were all about and what you're all about, because it pushed to the limit, and you really learned what your limits were and what you could go, what thresholds you could go through and still survive and do fine. And all of that, there were abuses now and then. Some of the, as you went through OCS, the different phases, so let's say you were in the first third of the thing, you were in the lower part of the class. The people who were in the last third were being trained to be leaders and officers. So they were given responsibility, cadre type responsibilities, in other words, leadership responsibilities for the junior classes coming in. So the people who were in the first group, I can't remember what we were called, but I know at West Point they call them plebes, but I can't remember what they call us in OCS. But in the first third in the lower class, the people who were in the senior division, the last third, could come down and discipline you. So they'd come into our barracks at night, and you're supposed to be in there, let's say, studying for a class tomorrow, because you did have to study certain things and logistics and what have you, and military training and everything. And they'd start to harass us. They'd say, well, you've done something wrong, or you do this, and they'd give you demerits. And, well, here's an example of how I think, sure, people make mistakes if they're human, but in general in the Army, they really do watch out for the person and try to protect everybody's human interests and rights and treat everybody as fairly as they can, no matter what their creed or their color or their size of their body or what they look like or what have you. And one of the senior, we were called candidates for officers. We were officer candidate school, so you're a candidate. So one of the senior candidates started harassing us while we were waiting to go into the dining hall to eat. While you were at the dining hall, you had to line up in a straight line at attention. And you stood at attention and waited your turn to go to the dining hall. So here'd be 100 people lined up, and you'd be filing in slowly one by one. And every time you stopped, you had to stay at attention and stay straight ahead. Well, the seniors would come by and try and distract you so that your eyes would be distracted to look elsewhere. And if you just even looked the other way without looking straight ahead, the senior could make you do, let's say, push-ups to amend, so that you remember how to stare straight ahead and concentrate on what you're supposed to be doing. Well, one of the friends of mine this good friend of mine from that I befriended at OCS had bow legs, and everybody kidded him about having bow legs, but he took it in stride and just laughed it off, and anyway, so we had all sorts of stories about why he had bow legs. Well, this senior candidate came down and started harassing and making fun of this guy's bow legs. And the captain, the real captain, the one who was actually in charge of the entire company of OCS, the captain that was in the regular Army, who was a wonderful guy, by the way, came by and heard the senior candidate harassing this young man for having bow legs, which was nothing he could help. And to teach all 100 of us standing out there in the heat, in the parking lot, waiting to go into the dining hall, he berated this senior in front of all 100 of us and embarrassed the devil out of him, which was a wonderful thing. But it made you realize that, you know, you really have to look at people as themselves and not abuse the power that you have as an officer in the military. So that was just one example of it. There were many, many different things like that. Another time in OCS, they would always bring us out into these blacktop parking lots in the middle of summer down in Virginia where it was very hot, and have us stand at attention and talk to us. And they weren't trying to harass us, they were just trying to teach you to tolerate heat. And so they would stand there and talk to us about, you know, well, you didn't do this right, or you did that right, or, you know, you're coming along, but you really have a long way to go, and all this other stuff. So one of the things, I can't remember what it was it was at the end of the day and it was before dinner, but we were all to report to the headquarters of our company where this captain's office was. And so we all lined up in the parking lot. We're standing at attention waiting for him. And the tactical officers are walking up and down the rows to make sure we're at perfect attention and have our uniforms on just right. And the captain comes out and he says, you know, stand at ease, and I'm going to talk to you. And so he starts talking to us. And he's standing under a canopy which protruded out of the front door of the building, out of the heat of the sun. And as he's talking, all of a sudden a dark cloud comes over, and sure enough, it starts to rain. Well, you can imagine how hot and humid it is down there, and the downpours they had were unbelievable. The rain is coming down in buckets. We're standing there watching this man who is our captain, supposed to be our true leader, and we're not supposed to hate this man. We're supposed to respect him and follow him, whatever he says. He realizes that he's losing us because we're standing out in the rain, and the rain's pouring down, and we're getting soaked, and we can't move an inch. And he's under the dry area. He walks out into the rain and stands in front of us in the rain and gets wet just like us, which taught us that he really did care about us and didn't want to look like he was above us or he was dry and we were wet. He said, we're all in this together, even though I'm your leader and I'm responsible for training you and teaching you how to do whatever it is you're going to learn here in this 26 or 7 week program. So things like that, little things like that you remember that taught you that, you know, nobody's above anybody else. They might outrank them and they might have to use that rank for different reasons to accomplish their mission or what have you. It wasn't, I'm better than you, or whether it's the bow legs or it's the rank or it's, you know, the size of the body or whatever it is. So little things like that you remember. And then the rotten times you forget. I mean, there were certainly times where, you know, they'd give you some task to do at OCS where you were out in the field all day, or you're in class, and then you got back and you had to get the barracks in perfect shape, and then you had to study, and you know, you had to be in bed by 10 o'clock at night, and the lights went out. Well, of course, you snuck out into the bathroom or something like that, the latrine, to go and read your book. You know, you made believe you're in the stall going to the bathroom or something like that, to sit there and read your book, because if they caught you up during the night, they could give you more demerits or give you all sorts of bad discipline and things. So you did things like that. It wasn't sneaky, it was just using your ingenuity to be able to get things done. And they were teaching you that. They were teaching you to band together to figure out how, within the rules, you can, accomplish the mission. I keep using that term, accomplish the mission. I guess that's what they taught us. Another time, the tactical officer we had was very critical of all of our field gear, which was like the belt you wore with all the stuff hanging off, your canteen hanging off it, or a poncho or what have you. And it got very muddy when you were out in the field all the time because you were crawling around in the dirt and going across streams and all this other stuff. And of course, we had to have this perfectly clean the next time we went out, which could be the next day. Well, excuse me, we had no way in the barracks to wash the stuff or clean it up. Well, we tried to clean it up, pardon me, and it was wet and it wouldn't dry, and it was all stained and discolored and everything, and he was all over us. Well, about 4 or 5 of the guys going through OCS were married. And of course, you weren't allowed to have your wife anywhere near the barracks or what have you, but the wives accompanied them to the area, and they rented an apartment in the area where the wives lived without their husbands while the husbands were in training. Somehow or another, the guys that were married, 2 of them or something, got all the gear together and put it in a box somehow and got it to their wives. This was before they were even supposed to be seeing their wives. Somehow or another, they got it out to their wives. Their wives took it like on a Sunday. Maybe it's Sunday afternoon they could visit their wives. The wives took all the gear in a box, snuck it off the base, brought it home, washed it, and dyed it with some kind of green dye and brought it back the next day, because it was all supposed to be that camouflage green color. Well, of course, it didn't exactly match the camouflage green of all the uniforms, But Monday morning we get out there at 6:30 in the morning, whatever it is, bright and sunny day, and here's our tactical officer inspecting us, going up and down the line, and he notices that all of the gear that we have hanging off our belts is really clean and really looks like it's freshly dyed. And he's walking up and down and he's looking and he's nodding and he's walking and looking, and everybody is keeping a perfectly straight face at attention, waiting for him to discover what's going on. And he's baffled. He can't figure out how we possibly could have got this stuff all dyed into, very good looking, not quite new, but, refurbished order. And of course he starts in asking, and nobody wants to say what happened because it would be like you're going to get the other guy in trouble. So we all kept very quiet about it. Well, finally, he said something like, I'm not going to discipline anybody. I just want to find how you got it done. And somebody finally, we all finally told him how we got it done. And of course, he couldn't say, hey, you're doing great, because he wanted to keep us at bay, so to speak, because we were still in the first phase of our training, and they never really gave you a chance to receive a compliment. It was all harassment. But you could tell by the gleam in his eye that he knew that we were able to figure out things and, sort of like outsmart the whole system. But that was just, again, one of the things that I happen to remember that, those were good memories, those were the fun times. Another thing we used to do was we would have to eat sitting at attention. So you'd literally be sitting on the first 6 inches of the chair at attention, perfectly straight, eyes straight ahead, eating the so-called square meal, where you'd put the fork in the food and bring it up square, put it in your mouth, never move your eyes off straight ahead. And the tactical officers are walking around screaming and yelling at you if you didn't. Well, obviously you couldn't eat very much. You'd only be given a few minutes to eat, so you'd wind up, eating as fast as you could, and bring your tray up, put it into the disposal area, and then get back out there to do whatever the next task is. And you were exercising vigorously. You were on the go, 18 hours a day or more. Needless to say, we'd get hungry. We got in wonderful shape, and you were physically and aerobically and mentally and sharp, very sharp, but you got very hungry. So we figured out that you could call a local delicatessen or pizza place or hamburger place, whatever it is, and they would deliver. And they would bring the goods in. Somehow they would get by the front gate of the place, and they would bring it in and deliver it. And somebody would run out the back of the barracks long after the tactical officers had gone home and pay the guy. And we'd have to pay him an exorbitant amount of money. Remember, they were very expensive. They knew they had it, so the local place would charge us whatever they could. So everybody would throw in their $4 or $5, whatever it is. And we'd give the guy a big order, and he'd bring it, and we'd bring it, and we'd sneak into the shower area, and we'd hide behind the partitions and eat real quickly, thinking that all the tactical officers were gone. This would be like at midnight or so. Sure enough, one of the tactical officers is still there, and of course he walks in and he says, well, what have we here? Can't eat. What's the matter with the Army's food? Everybody's standing at attention. Of course, we're standing in our skivvies, and we have to stand at attention. So he gets a trash barrel, which was, of course, the trash barrels were spit and polish clean. You had to clean the trash. You could literally eat, well, of course we could eat out of the trash barrels. Let me finish. He takes the trash barrel and takes all the food and throws it in. And he says, well, you want to eat? We're going to eat. Come on, everybody's going to have an equal share. We can't take one more than the other. Everybody's got to share equally in this. Everybody's got to watch out for their fellow officer. So he has each of us dig our hands into this mush of hamburgers and pizza and whatever it is, and eat a piece of it out of the barrel. And now he says, no, I don't want anybody else thinking they can eat outside of our mess hall. The Army food is fine. You don't go eating in the middle of the night. We're disciplining, on and on and on and on. And then, of course, he threw it on the floor, and you had to clean that up and get back in the bed by, you probably had 5 minutes to clean the whole place up and do it. But anyway, that was Officer Candidate School. And that went on and on. And we graduated from Officer Candidate School in, if we started in March, we graduated in August or September, whatever it was. And you were commissioned a second lieutenant. And I happened to have been assigned to Fort Eustis, Virginia, the same place. And it was really like on-the-job training that you got, because we really had an administrative job where there was some kind of a logistical mission of that fort where you would, I think it was making sure that the supplies were brought in trucks, just right, or unloaded off trains or planes or something. It was all transportation oriented. But again, in the Army, you often didn't get a job assigned to what your training was. So here we were trained in transportation, and as I got in there, I worked for this captain, and the captain said, Lieutenant Toner, we need a person to be the chemical and biological and radiological officer for our company. So they made me the CBR officer, chemical, biological, radiological officer. I didn't know anything about it, so I had to go home and read the books on it and figure out what to do. And it basically was make sure that everybody's got a gas mask, and then whenever we would go out in the field and drill, they would make believe that there was a nuclear explosion nearby. And we would have to develop reading the weather and trying to calculate from various meters that would read atomic radiation and what have you. The scenario as to where the radiation might fall, would there have been a nuclear explosion in this area? Pardon me, and what would you do with the troops, and how would you notify the local populace and all this other stuff? So that was all part of the, and somehow or another I got that job, among others. I had another job of logistical, inventory, like keeping track of all these things and where they were. But that was just training stuff. You knew that you were going to Vietnam. You knew that's the reason you're in the Army. You knew that was the reason. In the back of your mind, you'd think, oh, gee, maybe I won't have to go. But of all the 100 people that went to OCS with us, probably 98 went to Vietnam. One of my friends did. When I graduated from OCS, my parents came down. Everybody's parents came down, but your parents came down to the Officer Candidate School graduation, and it was kind of a festive day. They had your fancy dress blue uniform on, and you had on your lieutenant's bars for the first time, and the tactical officer that you learned to hate 20-something weeks ago, you actually respected at that point. People like the captain that stepped out of under the canopy and into the rain when he was lecturing us, you shook his hand and saluted him and said, you did a good job of training me and I respect you and all that. But of course, there's a general there, the general in charge of the post, and he was the one that gave the main speech. And so after the speech, everybody filled out of the auditorium, and they were standing around out in front, and the general was there and the colonel, and I met them and I was talking to them. And of course, my mother comes right over and she starts pointing her finger at the general's chest saying, now, it's wonderful that you trained my son, but he's not going to Vietnam. You can't send him to Vietnam. And so my father standing like, God, relax, mother, get away from the general, let him alone. As my father comes over to me, he says, oh my God, you just got orders to go to Vietnam. That general's going to go and call the Pentagon tomorrow and have you shipped out. Your mother should have kept her mouth shut. But anyway, that was just a joke. That my mother, I think she was serious about it. My father was, saying, oh, who knows how it'll react. Of course, that probably had nothing to do with what orders were cut. A friend of mine, a good friend of mine from OCS, who I thought would be going to Vietnam just like the rest of us, wound up getting assigned to riot control, because we were in Virginia and we were about 150 miles, let's say, from Washington, D.C. He was assigned to a unit whose main function was riot control because there were so many war protests going on around the Capitol. So when he, was training for all these crowd control and war protest control exercises, they realized after 6 or 8 months of this that he was invaluable and they had to keep him there. And so the only thing he did was go out and line the troops up around the Pentagon or the White House or Pennsylvania Avenue or the Capitol or something. And it was kind of passive, as he said. Everybody just stood there and didn't really have to, the crowds weren't really violent. They would just walk up to them and throw flowers on them and what have you. But he said many times they went out. A couple of times they had to throw tear gas, but he said most of the time it was very passive. And so he kind of had a plush life, because when they'd get assigned to go to Washington, oftentimes they'd let them sleep in these fancy barracks that they had around the Washington area and military facilities. So he wasn't by any means in any kind of a life-threatening situation. Excuse me while I have a sip of water here. So here I was at Fort Eustis, Virginia, from let's say August or September of '67 until June or July of '68, when of course orders came down that we were going to Vietnam. And it was a phase that, in other words, it was all set up from day one. You went into the basic training and you went through the 10 weeks of that, advanced infantry training, officer candidate training, and then so many weeks or months of on-the-job, so-called training as a commissioned officer, and then they knew that you'd be going to Vietnam because, as we all know, in the Vietnam area, personnel were supplied to Vietnam on an individual replacement basis, not on a unit basis. So as one person's 1 year term, which was the usual time you spent in Vietnam, was up, they had to get a replacement. So they just somehow call the Pentagon and get a person at a particular base and ship them in. It wasn't an entire infantry division or a brigade or a company or whatever, a battalion. They weren't shipped in as a group. That wasn't the way they did it in the Vietnam era, which is another whole discussion as to whether that was good or bad. Historically, we found out that, everybody found out, not just me, but military historians and tacticians and what have you, that that was a poor way to do it, because there was no morale, there was no cohesion within the unit. You'd be dropped into a unit in Vietnam where you knew no one, and you had just met that person for the first time, yet within a few days it was expected that you'd be up to snuff, learning the wherewithal of the mission that was required, what the procedures were and the whole thing, and you were at a loss. Everybody was at a loss. No, it was chaos in some ways. Today they do it a lot differently. They have units trained in the States for a long time to make sure that they know exactly how they're supposed to perform before they're shipped out to a situation where they might have to fight or defend or what have you. But in Vietnam, you went as individuals. So a group of us who were at Fort Eustis, Virginia, working in various jobs went out. Happens that some of us were in the same OCS class, some weren't. When you get orders to go to Vietnam, you usually use the 20 or 30 days leave a year that the Army gives you. I think, as a matter of fact, I think if you're being assigned, in those days, if you're being assigned to a combat area, you got 30 days off. So we took the whole 29 days or 28 days, whatever it is. One of our friends was also being assigned to Vietnam. Excuse me, only his date to leave Fort Eustis was a little bit later. For some reason, he wouldn't have the whole 30 days. He lived in Monterey, California, and my friend lived in, one of my friends that was going at the same time I was, lived in New York, and of course I lived here in Long Meadow. So we decided that we would go across the country together and meet up with this other guy out on the West Coast, and all, try to assemble, let's say in San Francisco or something, before leaving. Then it turned out that our friend from California had a car at Fort Eustis, and he had no way of getting it across the country. So he asked my friend Bob from New York and I if we'd drive it across. Well, it turns out that this was a red Corvette Stingray. I think it was a 62 or 3 convertible. So here we are, two young guys on our way off to the war, so to speak. Excuse me. And we have a red Corvette to transport across the country. We made the best of it. We took 20-something days to get across the country. Took off and visited friends and relatives all over the country. Went to the Midwest. We went down to New Orleans and had a good time on Bourbon Street. We went to Texas, had a good time there, where my sister happened to be living at that time. We went to Nevada, Las Vegas. We went to Southern California, Northern California, had a good time. Delivered the car, but then, of course, it all came down to the date we had to ship out. So we went off to, it was an Air Force base near Sacramento, California. I can't remember what it was, and we flew to Vietnam. And I remember flying to Vietnam, all I could think was, oh my gosh, you're going to be getting out of the plane and you're going to be in a combat situation immediately. What do you do? Duck? The bullet's going to be flying as soon as you get off the plane? Little did you realize that Vietnam wasn't a war with lines. It was a war, it was a guerrilla type war, and there were no front lines. The war could be anywhere. The village could be a perfectly quiet farming village during the day, but a war zone at night. The same farmers working the fields that were allegedly South Vietnamese citizens were maybe your enemy. They could be Viet Cong, they could be North Vietnamese that came in that had decided to fight against the South Vietnamese and the American Army and would assemble as a guerrilla force under the cover of darkness. But in the daytime, would look just like farmers out there with their water buffalo working the rice paddies. And so anyway, we flew in from the West Coast of the United States into Saigon. And again, you were individual replacements, so you weren't a unit. And so you weren't 100 or 200 or 1,000 people going in as a unit. You were just individuals. You didn't know the person on the bus sitting next to you, the plane sitting next to you. You just rode into this place, and it was called a processing center. And you were checked into Vietnam, and they probably had gotten orders the night before saying, okay, we need some people in this town, this group is going there, and this group is going there. Don't ask me how they did it, but it wasn't a planned unit type replacement thing. It was individual replacement, so it made it that much harder. I don't recall spending the night at an air base outside of Saigon. I think they put us on a plane immediately. And they separated my friend Bob and I, and he was assigned to Cam Ranh Bay as a logistics officer to operate, help operate the port at Cam Ranh Bay, where ships came in and unloaded containers and pallets of goods for Vietnam. I was assigned to Quy Nhon. That was a relatively small city, probably about 10 or 12,000 Vietnamese, probably 3 times that many of American military in the area. That city would be about, I think it was about 150 or 75 miles north of Saigon on the coast, north of Cam Ranh Bay, south of Da Nang. Vietnam was divided by the Army into corps, in other words, sectors. And the first corps was the northernmost one, and the fourth corps was the southernmost one down in the Delta. So we were in the second corps, which was the Central Highlands and the middle of the coast of Vietnam. I was supposed to be assigned as a transportation officer working out of the supply depot, or as the Army called it, the depot, in Quy Nhon. And I came in late in the day at the airport there. I know, when we flew over from here, it was a charter plane. You could be on like a Pan Am or something like that. Well, in those days it was Pan Am, or some charter airline. Just chartered United Airlines, 747 or something like that. And they would fly you over. So it was pretty luxurious flying. You had stewardesses and the whole thing on regular meals. But then when you got to Vietnam, you had to be transported military planes. So they put us in a C-130. And there were no seats. They just put bodies into the C-130 until it was full. So there might have been, if it had capacity for 100, there were probably 200 GIs in there, or government people in there, with your duffel bag full of your stuff. So you sat down in your duffel bag and the plane took off and landed, and that was it. So I remember it landed 1 or 2 times because they dropped people off there here and there, and we were the last to get off in Quy Nhon. And they shipped us over to this headquarters, and they said to me, Captain so-and-so or Lieutenant so-and-so has been the night operations officer here for the past year, and he's about to leave in a few weeks. You'll replace him. And I said, will I be doing transportation work? No. Will I be doing whatever it is, chemical, biological? No. You'll be in charge of night operations. Well, I didn't know what that was, but they said, we have no place to put you up overnight, so we're going to send you over to this building that was a hotel in the French colonial era on the coast, which is only a few miles across town, and you'll spend the night there, and then we'll talk to you tomorrow, the next day. They drive me over to this, it was literally a hotel, 1 or 2, 3-story, with what looked like a tile roof and stucco walls. A very nice looking building, tile floors. We walk in, they give me a room. I have my own room. They say, well, nobody's going to be coming to get you again until the next day, so relax and enjoy yourself. You can get a meal at this place over here. There's an officers club down the road. I'm thinking I'm going to get shot at. It's a whole awakening to me that here I am, thousands of miles from home in a so-called war zone, and I'm standing at a hotel. Across the road is a beach in the bay at Quy Nhon. The breeze blowing in, the palm trees blowing in the breeze. I can get a beer wherever I want. I can walk up and down the street with the rest of the Vietnamese and everything is fine. I'm saying, well, where's the war? This is, war is hell. Here we are. And there were 2 or 3 or 4 other people in the same boat. So we, I don't know, I think we ordered a beer and put our feet up on the railing of the veranda and sat there and watched the sunset or watched the, the breeze go by or something. The next day or so, they did assign us, and I did become the night operations officer at this command post that pretty much it organized and managed the passive defense of this entire area. It was a logistical area. There was a port where ships could come in and unload. It was a big airport. There was a good-sized hospital there. There were an awful lot of supply depot type places. The Army was there. The Navy was there. So there's a lot of activity of trucking goods up and down the coast and up into the highlands west of where the town of Quy Nhon was. And so they had the responsibility of supplying the combat units that were out on the field fighting as far away as Pleiku and north of that, which was probably 75 or 80 miles west. The area was relatively secure from attack because the South Koreans had sent entire units to Vietnam to help. The South Koreans performed a lot of military police and passive defense activities, where they would set up camp. For example, they set up a perimeter around, the perimeter was miles and miles around this town of Quy Nhon, the city of Quy Nhon. They were probably 15 miles away from where the downtown area was, but you can imagine it's on the coast, so in an arc from the north side of the town all the way out into the western area and down to the south of the town, the South Korean army had set up this passive defense which pretty much kept us secure so that there wasn't an invasion of North Vietnamese troops or Viet Cong troops. And then, of course, we had Air Force fighters not too far to the north, probably 25 miles to the north. There was an air base up there, so they would fly sorties around and watch things and drop their ordnance on whatever they thought was enemy targets and what have you. And the Navy patrolled along the shoreline and the inlets and waterways all around, so we were relatively safe. Not that incidents didn't happen, because, as I said, this was not a war with definitive lines. You didn't know where the enemy was or what they were doing or what they were up to until it happened. So I would work from 7 at night till 7 in the morning, and you had no idea whether it was going to be a quiet night or an active night. Some nights everything would be quiet, and you'd be sitting around bored stiff, wondering, how am I going to last a whole year here? I'm spending 12 hours a night sitting here with 1 or 2 NCOs in it was virtually an office type setting. You had a desk and you had all sorts of communications gear around, and people would call into us to report in to say, from the outskirts, we're calling in to say everything is quiet, all safe, and they'd, once an hour or so, everybody would call in, and we'd have to check off who called in and what was safe and what wasn't, and coordinate the military police and the Koreans and whatever else was out there, and make sure that no enemy was sneaking into the town or doing anything to sabotage things. But of course, the best laid plans don't always work out the way they should be, and many a night, everything would be dead quiet. In the middle of the night, there'd be an enormous explosion, and lo and behold, Viet Cong or North Vietnamese, they called them sappers, which were guerrillas, would somehow sneak in with unbelievable defensive revetments and what have you in place. For example, around the supply depot, they had stacks and stacks and stacks of containers of everything from ordnance, guns and what have you, to boots and hats and fatigues and food and everything else. These people would tunnel under the fence and come in and steal all sorts of stuff, and nobody would even know it, because the yards where they stored all these things were so big. They'd dig a tunnel, and the tunnel would come up into the middle of the containers somewhere in some corridor between the containers, and they'd be stealing stuff left and right, and nobody would know it. They would sneak into one of the favorite targets were oil tanks. There were giant petroleum storage areas for aviation fuel, fuel for the ships, fuel for generators, fuel for trucks. And they would put explosives at the base of the oil tanks and then sneak out. I don't know if they'd tunnel in or how they'd get in. And of course, all of a sudden, the oil tank would blow up, and when an oil tank with hundreds of thousands of gallons blows up, it makes a large boom. And it was like, the whole town was on fire, which, then of course the military is scrambling around trying to catch who snuck in and put the fire out and prevent it from burning other places. And it would cause an awful lot of concern of the local citizenry, because the local citizenry in Vietnam was torn between siding with the South Vietnamese, which they doubted the strength and honesty of the South Vietnamese government because of all the corruption and the aristocracy that ran the country, the 1 or 2% that ran the country, and the peasants had nothing, and they doubted that. And of course, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong would come in and say, if you join this communist government we have, you too will have a share in all of the wealth. So they would be torn between the two. And in a way, the American military could have done a better job of winning over the hearts and minds of the people, but again, that didn't happen. And hindsight is cheap, but if that had happened, of course, the outcome of the Vietnamese War might have been entirely different. But anyway, when they would blow up an oil tank, of course, that was a spectacular thing. And then that would be an indelible impression on the minds of the local people, because they realized that the might of the American and South Vietnamese army can't hold out these few guerrillas that can sneak in there and blow up in a great big oil tank and make this spectacular fireworks display in the middle of the night. And of course, when that was happening, we would not have a quiet night, and we would have to call up all of the MPs and all the colonels and everybody and all the troops, and people would have to get out of their beds and get on perimeter defense and make sure that they weren't going to come in and attack us. But luckily, I was never under fire, and I didn't see much combat at all. The worst that ever happened to the city of Queen Yan, where I was the Tet Offensive of 1968, which I missed. Tet Offensive was in February of 1968, and I missed that. But there was always some kind of activity going on. They were trying to blow something up or steal something or cause some kind of problems. But we would just spend the night quietly some nights, and other nights you couldn't tell, and you couldn't leave. I couldn't go anywhere. You had to remain on your post at all times for the 12 hours. They'd bring in a meal during the middle of the night. It was usually one or two people. Excuse me. The radio person or whoever your NCO was working with you, you got to know very well, sitting with them 12 hours a night you didn't have a day off. Nobody had a day off for 365 days. Well, I shouldn't say that. You probably had, out of 365 days in Vietnam, you probably had 3 days off, maybe 4. I can't remember that. I can remember 1 or 2 days off. That was about it. Once I called it a day off, I got to carry a pouch, which was a bunch of important papers that had to go from the field to the U.S. military headquarters outside of Saigon. And an officer had to carry this pouch to a particular place and sign, had to be signed in. I don't even know what was in the pouch, probably some kind of secret papers or something. But you got to fly on a plane to Saigon and spend the night, and so I flew down, delivered the pouch. It took you only an hour to deliver the pouch. And of course, then they had to wait until the next day to get the plane back. And I got to visit with one of the guys that I knew from OCS who was assigned to the city of Saigon, and we got to go out to dinner in Saigon and all that, which was a big city. Now, there's a war zone. Saigon, a city of allegedly 1 million people, it probably had 2 million or more in it during the war of refugees that came in. And there was a bustling economy going on there, both black market and regular economy. You could go out to dinner. You could, buy anything you wanted, from boots and trinkets to girls and narcotics. But there was a bustling economy going on. Again, the Vietnamese people are a resilient people. They appear to have withstood dictatorships and marauders and wars and invasions. And in my opinion, the town I was in Queen Yan, a relatively small town, and then once you get outside Queen Yan, it was very rural. Just rice paddies and farming up on the hillside. They scratched a living out of a mountainous country with very few resources and were able to live. And they lived a very simple life. Their life was complicated by the invasion of the military. For example, they'd never seen they'd seen motorized vehicles, but would never drive them. And all of a sudden, thousands and thousands of South Vietnamese are being inducted into the army and given all this equipment that the Americans gave them. For example, the Jeep. They didn't know how to drive. They didn't know what it meant to drive. The favorite thing of Vietnam was if you had a Jeep and you were going down the road, and there are other Jeeps or other vehicles parked on the right side, be careful, because they hadn't been trained how to pull away from a parking space at the curb. They just drove out, no matter whether traffic was coming or not. So you had to be very careful. Otherwise, and of course, there were accidents galore and unfortunately casualties and everything. But there was still, it was a war-torn country, but there was a vibrant economy going. A few times, as I say, I worked all night long. A few times during the day, some of the NCOs or some of them, we would get in a Jeep, 4 of us would get in a Jeep, and just take off and go for a joyride. We'd go out and take our cameras and just go take pictures of the countryside, which, by the way, was beautiful. You can imagine. Sure, it was hot and warm, but there'd be beautiful breezes, beautiful mountains, blue skies, rice paddies that had shades of green on it that were beautiful. And here you were driving around taking pictures. Yeah, somebody could have been a Viet Cong guerrilla or something and blown us up, but most of the vehicles on the road were Vietnamese on bicycles or little mopeds, and then other than that, it was big military trucks. So other than that, time went on, and somehow you got through it. I will always remember. Matter of fact, I said this was a definitive moment. I knew I was in the Army, and I knew I was in a war zone when on Christmas Day, I went to Phu Cat Air Base, which was up north of where we were about 25, 30 miles. I got off work at 7 o'clock in the morning, and somebody said, we're going up to Phu Cat Air Base, and it's Christmas Day. I said, what are we doing up there? They said, we're going to see Bob Hope and his show. And here are, there must have been 5,000, 7,000 GIs, our Air Force, Army, whatever, in this big field with an impromptu stage set up by the Air Force at this Air Force base. And here's Bob Hope putting on his show with the dancing girls and the singers and the comedians and the whole thing. Anne Margaret was with them. And, they played, and it was a great show. And whether the entertainment was good or bad, we didn't care. We just were, happy to see them, and it was so much fun. And he really put a wonderful show on. And then you realize that this guy was, well, he died at almost 100 a year or two ago. And in those days, he was in his 70s. And here he was putting on shows for 2 or 3 weeks in a row. He put on, I think somebody said 5 shows Christmas Day, because they helicoptered either from our place or had come in by helicopter from an aircraft carrier off the coast. So here he was flying out to the aircraft carrier, flying back, and then doing 3 or 4 more shows that day. So I mean, he was a man that was devoted to serving the troops that were overseas. But as I say, you really felt like you knew that you were you were in the Army when you'd finished a Bob Hope show on Christmas Day. I try to think of other things that it all blended together after a while. You didn't have much fun, I mean, you didn't have nights off, so I couldn't go out and I mean, there were officers' clubs around, and you could go into town sometimes. Sometimes they would, excuse me, the military police or someone would find that they knew through intelligence or what have you that there were more infiltrations, let's say, of Viet Cong or North Vietnamese sneaking in to areas around Quy Nhon, and they closed the town down. They'd say no one's allowed outside of the military compounds, and we had to be on a certain degree of alert to make sure that nobody was sneaking in or causing attacks or something. And you had different phases of alertness depending upon what the intelligence reported. But at times you could go down to the village. I mean, we'd walk out the end of our compound, probably 200 or 300 yards through the gate, and there we were on a busy street. And like I say, you could buy things if you wanted to, and you could walk around. There was a beach. You could go swimming if you wanted. At one time, when things were considered quiet, the Army provided little boats that we could go to the beach and swim, and you can go out. I think they were like Hobie cats or something, sailfish or something like that. You could go out and sail if you wanted to. You could swim. Then they, after a while, they closed that down because they thought it was too much of a security risk. And then things kept expanding in Quy Nhon, and this depot wasn't big enough, and they had to develop a second satellite one about 10 miles out. So I got assigned to that, and I got moved from the downtown port area out to the 10-mile distant out to the west, out another couple of roads. I don't know where we drove out the main highways. And they built a whole new depot out there. The minute I got to this new depot, I said to myself, what did they build this here for? All around it were these big mountains. Well, I would think that if they were fighting a guerrilla force, they could easily sneak up into those mountains and hide under the brush and launch mortars or grenades or whatever, rockets or something, right into our compound. But I don't know, they knew more than I did, and I wasn't in charge of setting up the security of that perimeter, and they didn't ask me about it. I was still in charge of the night operations, the same as we were in the other place. And I know that they would have artillery firing off into the hills beyond us, thinking that there might be some troop concentrations. I know that they would fire cannons from the battleship New Jersey from, I think, up to 25 miles off the coast. And the shells would travel 25 or 30 miles in and bomb. And then if they would have Air Force fighters drop their ordnance around the hills, we'd see, they'd fly in, and all of a sudden they'd disappear over the hill, and you'd hear this enormous explosion, and they'd fly back out. Once in a while we'd get reports of casualties or what have you. Unlike the bombs they use today in the Iraq or Iran and what have you wars, where they have these smart bombs that hit targets within 100 feet of each other. But so we spent the rest of the time in Vietnam. Oh, we did get on an R&R, as they call it, rest and relaxation. I got to go to Sydney, Australia, and spend a week, which was fun. That was nice to get away, see the sights. At the end of the time that I was there, my replacement came in, and this man was taking over the night operations job for me, so I had about the last month of training him. So this would have been, if I left at the end of June, beginning of July of '69, if I came and you were there a year, so I was there from the summer of '68 to summer of '69, and this man came in to replace me. Excuse me, and I don't know how it happened, but somehow or another, it came about that there was a vacancy on a plane for another R&R to Hong Kong. And my friend Bob from New York that was stationed in Cam Ranh Bay heard about these vacancies. And he said, if you can get down to Cam Ranh Bay, we've got tickets or orders or what have you that we can take this other R&R. So I somehow got permission, because my replacement man was in, to take another week off. So probably about 6 or 8 weeks before I left Vietnam, I got a second R&R to Hong Kong, thanks to the government. And so, in the situation you're in, you didn't ask. You say, hey, I put my time in. There's an opportunity to go to Hong Kong, I'm going. And so it was wonderful to see Hong Kong, and it was great to get to visit and see the city and what it's like. And it was a nice break to get away. Then we came back, and finally your date of return to the United States comes, and you fly out and go home. And well, as I say, I didn't get involved in combat, and I was lucky to get out without any kind of calamity, and some weren't, unfortunately, and we always have to remember them that didn't make it, and the ones that did. In retrospect, as I say, talk is cheap and hindsight is cheap, but you look back and say it would have been, the war really could have been conducted in a lot different fashion, and I think the results would have been a lot different. The political forces and the restraints on the military were unbelievable. For example, it got to the point where, I don't know if it was Washington or the Pentagon or somebody was constraining the operation so much that the military was never unleashed to be able to do what they had to do to stop the enemy. It was always, politically it was always a war that we shouldn't be in, and we really don't want to put the pedal to the metal, because if we do, it's really going to cause a lot of political ramifications. So between LBJ and Nixon and the whole thing, ceasefires, bombing Cambodia, bombing the North Vietnamese supply routes north of the DMZ, none of that worked. And no matter how they did it, it didn't work, because they were using conventional Western political methods to fight a war in a country that was so foreign to them and not used to guerrilla warfare, and unaware of the composition of the people and the thinking of the people and the way it worked. Winning the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people would have been awfully difficult. Take, for example, the so-called pacification systems that they tried to put in. And they had everybody from CIA to Peace Corps and everybody else in there trying to do this. They'd go into the fields and they'd say to the people, we're your friends, we're here to help you. You don't have to convert to become a Viet Cong to survive here, we'll help you. For example, you grow rice in this paddy, and you've been growing rice in this paddy for generations, for years. You only grow the rice during the warm season, 6 months a year or whatever it is. I mean, warm season, it's always hot over there, but there's only a season for the rice. The Americans came in there with agricultural experts and diplomats and everybody else and said, we'll be able to teach you how to grow 3 seasons of rice, and you'll get 3 times as much crop out of it, and we'll be able to, it was like bioengineering. These people, they were peasants without any education whatsoever. All they knew was survival. When somebody came in and said they're going to teach them how to grow 3 times as much rice, they were so skeptical, they ran the other way. They had no idea. And you can imagine, they'd look at us and say, how old is your country? 200 years old? Guess what? We've been doing this for 2,000 years the exact same way. And you're telling us to change it? Who are you? So, no matter what type of new thing that we tried to introduce there, we just couldn't export our methods. And it just didn't apply over there. That's nothing to do with the military being constrained by the politicians. At our level, where I was, in the little town of Queen Yan with a passive defense system, we would get calls in from the perimeter, and here's some poor GI, some guy out there who's got 1 or 2 stripes on his shoulder, into the country, has got guard duty all night, or for hours at night, and he's looking out there wondering what in the heck is going on, and all he can see out there is darkness and brush. He doesn't know if one of these Viet Cong is sneaking around or not. All he's got is a rifle. He calls in and says, I think we see some movement. Do we have permission to shoot? We would have to call around to find out if we could fire in that area. For all we knew, the military police or the intelligence group or something like that had some people maneuvering around out there, and they didn't tell us about it. So before anything could happen, this guy who was up in the guard tower, is making some noise about it, and the people out there in the field that were, let's say they were Viet Cong, they heard him. They're not going to hang around, they're going to take off. Whereas if this guy would have had some kind of training and all the way down the line, a whole system in place that said this entire area, whatever it is, a sector, a county, a neighborhood, or whatever it is off limits to anybody, and we know there's nobody but enemy in there. If they move and you have to shoot them, you have to shoot them. Not to be cold about it, but I mean, if you're going to conduct a war, and they didn't do that. And so, one of the many, many things. When I got back to the States, you have to readjust. You say to yourself, oh, I'm fine. I wasn't in combat. Nothing bothered me. And you came back, and you were happy to be back, and immediately you got back to the States, and you're talking to friends and relatives, and everything's lovely. And it did affect you. It was there was definitely a pull on your psyche when you got back. I never expected that there'd be a parade for anybody when they got back. I was never the subject of ridicule for having gone. A lot of my friends were pacifists, were definitely against the war. And, we intelligently discussed the pros and cons of it and why one went to the war and what went through and all that other. I was asked by friends, would you like to join the anti-war movement and, get active in it? And I never did that. I did change my attitude from the time that I was training and going off to the war and coming back, in that I do think that we did make some major, major mistakes in that war, and I think that we almost shouldn't have been there, but that's just my opinion, and it's happened and it's history. It's tragic for the 57,000 people, Americans that died there. It's tragic for the 300,000 Vietnamese that died, North Vietnamese, the same number. It's just, wars are awful and they'll always be awful, and what worse thing could man do to man or human beings do to human beings than conduct war, but that's the way it was. I got back and visited friends and family, and I didn't go to work right away. You're kind of lost in a way when you get back. You have to readjust, and my parents and family and everybody said, well, just relax and do what you want and take it easy, which I did. And that got old after a while. But at times, you had some moments of depression and everything. I don't recall anybody from the VA or anybody else saying, if you feel bad, come, help us out or everything. And I didn't have it that bad, but I saw, and we've all today even seen scars of this war where veterans got back and they didn't get any help, and they needed it, and they really needed it badly, and their lives were completely ruined by it. They came away literally unscathed, but they saw some awful things in that war that affected them terribly. And I don't care where you're from or what kind of upbringing you had or what kind of strength of character you have or what kind of training you've had. I would think that the few things that I saw could really try a person's soul, and you'd wonder, how you could survive that psychologically when you get back. So. Again, that's one of the perils of war that's tragic. It's invisible. You don't see it. Some people just carry that with them. I personally think that, as I say, I wasn't exposed to enough that really affected me that badly. One of the things in general about the military, in my experience, is that, and I talked to other people about it, you remember the good times. You don't remember the bad times. You cherish the people that you met over there, either in Vietnam or in training or what have you, and you have some good friends. As an anecdote, the OCS class, as I say, once you finished OCS, you disbanded as a unit and you got assigned as individual replacements. So that unit didn't stay together. But there's a great deal of camaraderie from the 100 people that went through OCS together, because you lived, slept, crawled in the mud, and supported each other all the way for those 27 weeks or whatever it was. Someone along the line decided to have a reunion, I want to say in 1997 or 8 or whatever it was. And we had the reunion down near Fort Eustis, Virginia, in Williamsburg, Virginia. And I get a call from a guy about 4 or 5 months before, and the guy has a real heavy North Carolina accent, and he calls me like on a Sunday night. And on the other end of the phone, I hear the Southern accent say, Bill Toner, and I say, yeah. And the guy tells me who he is, and I'm saying, what is this, a hoax or something? Who's this guy? And I hardly remembered who he was. And he started talking, and I said, oh my gosh, do I remember? And he said, we're going to have a reunion. I said, oh, that's great. Who are you going to get together? And then everybody started calling everybody else. So out of 100 people, we probably had 30-something that went to the reunion. But the reunion was great. It was wonderful to see everybody. It was astonishing how successful everybody's life was. I don't know if the people who had bad lives didn't want to go. A lot of people wrote letters and said they're sorry they can't make it, but they'd love to if they have a wonderful. And to a person that went to the reunion, sitting around, and you sat around and talked a lot at this weekend reunion. You talked a lot about what went on. To a person Many of us had afterwards been to college, graduate school, had law degrees, business degrees, were very successful in whatever their career endeavors were and their families and what have you. To a person, whatever formal education they had in college, graduate school, whatever, they said it paled compared to the education you got going through the training in the military and all of the experiences you had, because it taught you so many things that you could never learn in a classroom. You could never learn, leadership experience, tolerance of things, being alert to your everything, people, differences. It just, just went on and on and on. And that was a good time going to the reunion. Since then, you see some of your friends that were in the military with you, and you have association with them, and everybody changes, but you always had that one thing in common. Would I do it again? Yes, I'd do it again. I'd do it again. Would I recommend it for people? If you want it, It's awfully hard to decide what to do with your life when you're 18 or 20 years old about the military. I can remember going to college at 18 years old. As I said, I went to Longmeadow High School. I graduated. I was fortunate enough to be able to go to Georgetown University, a good college, Washington, D.C. And I can remember going to the gym where you signed up for classes the first semester of your freshman year, and you're scrambling around making sure you get, the right basic English or basic math course or whatever you had to take. And here are the officers from the military recruiting people for the ROTC program. And you had to go through this corridor where they all were. And these colonels and majors are saying to you, young man, do you know what you're doing? There's going to be a draft. You could be an officer. You'd be trained for 4 years in ROTC. You'd come out. You'd have a prestigious position, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, well, no, thank you, sir. It's not for me. And I got through that and I said, are you kidding me? Going to that? I'm going to college not only to have a good time and, be Joe Average on campus, but to get a good liberal arts education. I don't want to be, having to do with the military. That's far beyond me. I'm never going in the military. I'll never have anything to do with it. Well, as the draft built up, you didn't have a choice. You had a choice. You could leave the country or you could go in. And I definitely decided not to leave the country, but to go ahead and accept the draft or join. So again, it's awfully hard to make that decision when you're 18 or 20 years old. Yet I fortunately had 4 years of college, a year of graduate school, and a year of work under my belt before I did make the decision, which matured you an awful lot. I can remember one of the guys I don't think he had any college at all, and somehow or another, I think you were supposed to have had a college degree to go to OCS, but somehow or another, he took some tests or something and came out of the regular Army, and he was 19 years old and started OCS. And he became a good friend and stayed with us, and he did fine in the military. He did okay. He, performed as a lieutenant and did okay. So it can be done. As I say, and many of the people that I was with, one of the guys has been to law school and was working for a prestigious Wall Street law firm and got drafted, so he had to go. So many of the people had a lot of experience before they went, which they brought to the table once they got in the military, which was a wonderful addition to the Army or the military, whatever you're in. So that's my boring story about life in the military, and as I say, no regrets. And I still, to this day, say that the experience and training is invaluable and is a wonderful asset to whatever your career, family life, whatever it's going to be. Between character stability, the sense of understanding, that you do have responsibilities, and you just learn to discipline yourself to do what has to be done. It's all in all a good experience. So thank you for listening. I hope I haven't bored anybody, and good luck.